Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CineHistorians podcast. This is episode 4 of season 2 of the show. As ever, I'm Carl Sweeney, alongside my co-host Raquel Stecher. Hi, Raquel.
Hey, Carl, how's it going?
It's going well. We're kind of rapidly, by the time we end this recording, we'll be at the halfway point of season 2.
Yeah.
It's pretty exciting. As a reminder to everyone joining us, our topic this season is the Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time from 2022. We've talked previously about the history of the Sight and Sound list, but this is the once every 10 years list that the British film magazine Sight and Sound does. 2022, of course, is, as we record, the most recent version of the list. And we've had a lot of fun so far, I think, talking about Jeanne Dielman, the Chantal Akerman film. We've talked about Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. We've talked about the Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica. And on this episode, we're talking about 1973's The Spirit of the Beehive. So, very interesting one today, Raquel. How do you want to kick us off? Do you want to start us with some background on the director of this movie? Or where do you want to start?
Yes. So let's talk about Víctor Erice. He was born in 1940 in the Basque region of Spain. And as a young adult, he pursued several majors while studying at the University of Madrid, but ultimately he was called to film studies. So in the early 1960s, he studied at La Escuela Oficial de Cinematografía, and he started making short films. And like other filmmakers, including ones we've talked about on this podcast, he also dabbled in film criticism before becoming a film director. So his feature film debut was The Spirit of the Beehive from 1973, obviously the film we're talking about today. And Erice worked with a well-known Spanish movie producer, Elias Querejeta, on that film, and as well on El Sur, which translates to The South from 1983, which wasn't completed due to that same producer pulling funding, but was still released in its current form. Erice made films during like a very turbulent era of Spanish history during the Francisco Franco's dictatorship. It was a risky time for filmmakers in Spain. They had to be very cautious and carefully disguise any sort of political messaging in their films, and we'll definitely go into that in this episode, like how this film is very allegorical and fantastical in terms of how it portrays a different message. Erice's filmography is fairly small. He's only ever directed 3 feature films and 2 documentaries. He's made several short films and contributed to film anthologies. But where he lacks in volume, he makes up for films that are very rich in like symbolism, allegory. They're very visually stunning. His films explore like innocence, imagination. They have like complex father-daughter relationships. They explore like the power of cinema and then life in post-Spanish Civil War Spain. And Erice is still working today. His most recent film was Close Your Eyes, which is a drama about an actor who goes missing during a film production. And then 20 years later, his director is tasked with solving the mystery of what happened to him. And that film came out in 2023 and also stars Ana Torrent, who plays the protagonist in The Spirit of the Beehive.
Yeah, I wonder if he'll be one of those filmmakers like Terrence Malick is the one who springs to mind, who was very kind of sporadic for years and years and years. And then suddenly in more recent years, he's got very prolific. I don't know, but it would be nice.
It would be, yeah.
Okay, so let me introduce people to this film. As ever, spoilers ahead. So if you haven't seen The Spirit of the Beehive, now's a pretty good time to pause the episode, go and watch the movie, and then come back to us. So the film is released in 1973, but it's set at the beginning of the Franco dictatorship. It's set shortly after the end of the Spanish Civil War. So very interesting just immediately that then it's released much nearer the end of Franco's time. Franco died in 1975. Spain soon transferred to democracy. So it's released at a kind of approaching a transition point, and it kind of spans that era with when the movie itself is set. We get on-screen text at the start of the film that tells us the film is taking place someplace in the Castilian Plateau around 1940. So actually the sort of vagueness around that messaging, the kind of ambiguity there is quite interesting in terms of what the film is like. We're introduced to a man called Fernando who keeps bees. He has a wife, Teresa, who writes letters to somebody who she has apparently been separated from. There appears to be a kind of a distance between the married couple, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. But they have two young daughters, Isabel and Ana. And one day the two girls go to a local screening. It's like a makeshift screening where the town crier announces that the movie's going to be shown and people are bringing their own chairs. It's really fun, actually. And it's a screening of the 1931 film version of Frankenstein. In other words, the first Frankenstein film where Boris Karloff plays Frankenstein's monster. And the film makes a deep impression on Ana. She's especially captivated by the scenes in the film which involve Frankenstein's monster and a young girl. And then after the film, the sisters are talking. Isabel tells her sister the movie is fake, all movies are fake. However, the spirit of the monster does happen to live in an abandoned barn nearby. Ana believes her sister. She wants to find the spirit. And then one day she does find something, or in fact, someone. She finds an anti-Franco soldier who's in hiding, and Ana befriends him. I think that's probably where I'll leave it there for now. We'll talk more as we go on about all of these things that have come up, like the Frankenstein connections and the soldier who the girl meets and so on. But Raquel, did you have anything to tell us about sort of background on this film, how it was made or anything like that?
Yeah, so The Spirit of the Beehive actually started as a Spanish version of Frankenstein. So it was going to be this big budget commercial film with all the bells and whistles. And Víctor Erice was approached to directing it and writing the script. So it's not something he wanted to do, but he was very eager to make his first feature film. So he began writing a script treatment for it, but then the project never got off the ground because funding a project like that with all the sets and costumes and makeup would be a lot of money. So Erice actually came up with an alternate idea that he proposed to the producer. So while working on the Frankenstein script, he had a film still from that movie, the James Whale adaptation of Frankenstein from 1931. And it was of the monster and little Maria. And he looked at it every single day and he was thinking of his own experience as a child watching a movie. And he had seen Sherlock Holmes, the Sherlock Holmes film starring Basil Rathbone from 1944, I believe. It was called The Scarlet Claw. And that movie had a huge, profound effect on him. It showed him that life had real dangers. And he really wanted to write a story that kind of featured that storyline. So that's sort of the seed that germinated into the idea of The Spirit of the Beehive. He was particularly interested in the dynamic of how a child is affected by what happens in a film, that when they're at a certain age, they believe everything they are shown to be true, and how that sort of loss of innocence happens. Then we get this basically an allegory taking place in Francoist Spain, and this very multi-layered, rich story. And The Spirit of the Beehive actually was not a hit when it came out. It got mixed results. The folks at the San Sebastian Film Festival gave it a prize, but even people who attended that festival booed the film. But over the years, it's really grown in estimation, and people have really come to appreciate its film artistry. And so Spirit of the Beehive is on the Sight and Sound list of greatest films of all time. Its first appearance was in 2012, where it tied for the 81st place. And then it moved down a few spots in 2022 to be tied for 85th place. Now, fun fact, The Spirit of the Beehive is the only film in Spanish that has ever appeared on the list. There are no other titles from other Spanish-speaking countries, so nothing from Latin America. And just to clarify, I mean the principal spoken language in the film. There are other films in which Spanish might be spoken a little bit, but I mean, this is the main language in the film. So I did a breakdown of the languages of the films that are on the most recent Sight and Sound list. So you have 18 languages among 95 films, and the other 5 films are silent films. Most represented languages, like no one will be surprised by this, are English and French. There are 39 English films and 22 French ones. And then you break it down further. You got Japanese with 8, Italian with 6, Chinese with 4, Russian with 3, and German with 2. And the other languages all have single ones, and those include Arabic, Bengali, Czech, Danish, Farsi, Hungarian, Korean, Spanish with this one, Swedish, Thai, and Wolof. So that's kind of the broad scope. But yeah.
And I think that raises questions about something I think we've touched on before, but the idea of diversity was a big talking point around the 22 list, especially. Yeah. And then I suppose you sort of have to think, well, what kind of diversity is the list actually providing? So just based on the numbers you've thrown at us there, you could say actually it's a fairly shallow type of diversity because it seems to prioritize English language, especially American cinema. Like you say, French cinema sort of overrepresented in terms of non-English language cinema. And that's not a knock on French cinema because I'm somebody who likes a lot of French films, but I think there's sometimes a sense that people look at quote unquote foreign filmmaking and they look to France first and then kind of stop there. What do you think? Do you also think that with a filmmaker like Almodovar, for example, maybe because he's somebody who's got so many great movies, it's not like people voting for an Almodovar film have all gone for the same film, I would guess. And therefore, maybe that means he's not as well placed for a list like this, even if several of his films have got widespread critical acclaim. I mean, that doesn't answer the whole question, but I wonder if there's a little bit of that at play, because he's someone you would think might be in a list like this. So it's interesting that he's not.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would put something like All About My Mother, which is on the extended list, I believe, when you go into 250 titles. But also, his films are not terribly available in the US market. I know Sony Classics, I think, has the rights to some of his films, but they're not something that, they stream very regularly. And I think access is really key to some of these films. And I know we've talked about that in a previous episode, but Spirit of the Beehive seems to have been like really available. Like in the United States, it's available on the Criterion Channel kind of permanently. And I think that access also is a factor in like what makes it onto that list.
Also maybe about who gets the vote. So I suppose the question we could ask is what's more important? Is it who's voting on the list or is it the outcome of the list? Because to me, maybe the most important factor is like the list of critics voting should be fully representative and then let's just see what they come up with. But I suppose another way to look at it would be to want the list itself to be as diverse as possible. Right. I don't know. What do you want to see most? Do you want it to be about the composition of the critics making up the list, or are you more bothered about the final outcome, as it were?
I think maybe the final outcome, just because, I mean, myself, I am from the United States. I'm Latina, and I watch a lot of world cinema. So I might have a different perspective from another critic in the US who maybe limits themselves to French, Italian, Japanese cinema in terms of like the world cinema. So I think even if you were to get like a variety, or even if you were just to stick to what you had, it's still the outcome is, going to be dependent on the critics and their exposure, not necessarily where they're from. If that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's turn to The Spirit of the Beehive more generally then. Like you said, the film that was kind of controversial at the start, obviously had people calling it a masterpiece early on, took a while to build a wider audience. I think you've already hit on one of the key points that it would be useful to explore, which is that it's a film that's very often read symbolically in relation to the broader context of Spanish society. The idea, like you've used the word allegory already, that there's an allegory here about the emotional kind of state of Spain in dictatorship. People have latched onto the symbols in the film, like maybe the beehive is a symbol for the state of Spain under Franco, because it's like a very well-ordered beehive, but it's kind of I think it was Stuart Jeffries in The Guardian says the beehive is orderly but alien and spiritless. And that's, you start to get into these symbolic readings. Basically, the idea that it's about the shadow cast over Spain by Franco's rule. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because like if it's critiquing those things, I think a first-time viewer might miss a lot of that because it has to be done in a very indirect way, doesn't it? So what do you make of that? Do you think this is a film we should be reading? Like, should we be out there looking for those symbolic readings? Or I don't know. How do you take it?
As a former English major, I'm always about analysis and looking for the themes and the symbolism because that is part of the fun. But also, this film has a lot. And just to go back to your comment about the bees, that symbolism really stood out to me in my most recent viewing of the film. And that's what's great about this movie is that you get something from it on every viewing. And I was really paying attention to like the visual motif of like the honeycomb pattern and then like the symbolism behind like the bees and beekeeping, like you said about it being kind of representative of like the Spanish people at the time. I really came to appreciate the bees being like that allegory of living in a dictatorship. Like the bees are in the hive, they have their own sense of order, each bee has its own role, they coexist with each other in what could be an autonomous environment, but then there's like this greater power controlling them, the beekeeper, and he exerts his force beyond their means and he subjugates them with the smoke. Like you have that wonderful scene of him like smoking the hive so that the bees are calmer, and you can definitely liken that to like a dictator who's using his authoritative power, his military force to control the citizens. I actually want to read a quick review from Letterboxd from this user Manasa Maestra, and they said this is one of my favorite films ever, which is weird because when I first watched it I didn't like it at all. I was trying to analyze what made it so good and why it was regarded so highly by so many people, but it's a film you slowly learn to love. And I think that's key to this, is that it's a film that grows in estimation as you watch it. It becomes more potent with like different viewings. And I know some people might disagree, might say, okay, for a good movie, you have to fully appreciate it on that first viewing, and that might work for like a blockbuster movie or something that's like surface level. But there are films that go beyond that. There are films that are like multi-layered. They're different viewing experiences every time you watch it. It even depends like how you're watching it or where you're coming from personally, your knowledge. So I don't know. This is almost like a film that requires some effort of the viewer. Like there is that sort of mystery that you can take in, but you also kind of need to like work with it a little bit too.
I think you do have to work with it a little bit because I think some of these references to the broader context are quite coded. So the context is that the Franco regime actually was okay with the country producing some quote unquote quality or art house cinema because they did want to raise the status of Spanish cinema. But that doesn't mean they would allow overtly leftist movies to be made. So it means you get a lack of overt commentary, which creates that space for allegory. And it's part of a wider tendency that I think is very interesting. And I know we've talked about this before in relation to Iranian cinema about how filmmaking is made under repressive regimes and that kind of thing. And I think that's happening in Spain at this time too, but you get films that are using strategies to convey something without displeasing the ruling regime. So in this film, you kind of have to be just alert to the signs. So the village we see is in a bit of a state of disrepair, for example. It's kind of dilapidated. There are things that happen where we don't get the full context. We have to kind of surmise that, the father is listening to a radio and we can kind of intuit that he's listening to something that he might be forbidden to listen to, but I'm not sure that's made explicit. I've mentioned the mother is writing letters, which apparently, if you know the address, it's being addressed to a place where Spanish refugees were interned. The man in the barn, of course, is presumably from the resistance. I'll come back later to the family, but there's this very melancholy kind of feeling in the household, which is kind of suggestive of certain things. Apparently, if there's a photo album where the father is depicted alongside somebody who was a known critic of Franco, for example. So these things are there if you know to look for them. And most viewers won't know enough, I think. I wasn't in that position the first time I saw the film recently. I needed to kind of do a bit of digging to find all this out. So there's this kind of allegorical, like I said, coded nature of the film. And you mentioned about sort of being an English major and wanting to do the analysis. And that reminded me, in Roger Ebert's review, he says he thinks critics kind of go too much into the parallels. And he says, I feel like I'm reading term papers when people are trying to tease out these meanings of the film. But I suppose it means there is a different way to take this film, isn't there? So
Mm.
there's an aspect of it that I think is more universal, which is like everybody, we haven't all grown up in Spain, we haven't all grown up under dictatorship, but everybody who's grown up to be an adult went through childhood. And then what the film has to offer, which is really powerful, I think, is this quite mysterious like evocation of childhood, you
Yeah.
know. So I think that's the aspect of the film I really responded to, is like I think the depiction of the children and
Yeah.
Anna in particular is really powerful. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree. And also in this recent viewing, I came to appreciate the fact that there are two children and that the sisters play off of each other. And we learn actually a lot about Anna from Isabel. And because you have this contrast there, you know, Isabel's older, she's at a different like a stage in her development. She's lost some of the innocence that Anna still has. And we see like Isabel experimenting with some bad things and just seeing what she can get away with. Like she's lying to her sister about the monster living in the abandoned house, and she pretends to be dead. She tries choking her cat, which is like this the most bizarre scene in the movie. And then the cat bites her, and she draws blood from her fingers. She uses that finger and that blood to like paint her lips red. There's a scene where she's jumping over a bonfire. And this contrast between the two kind of shows like how innocent Anna really is, because she's not at that level, but also is giving us a warning that that stage is what's next for Anna, which I think is really interesting. I don't know. It's interesting too, because there's also like Isabel promises her an answer, and then Anna doesn't even believe her. So like Anna's starting to develop this distrust of older people, which becomes really important. So yeah, I feel like it's so powerful when you use stories with children, and it's not a movie for children per se, but the children are delivering a story on a greater theme, and you can do so much with that. And you can see that in this movie, and then also like in Bicycle Thieves or in Where's the Friend's House that we've talked about before.
Yeah, and it has that very personal feel, I think, because I think Erice
Mm.
and his co-screenwriter, they were kind of trawling through their own memories of childhood for things that could go into the film. So whether it was, doing an anatomy lesson, which is a memorable part of the film,
Yeah.
or like going out to pick mushrooms, and some of them are
Oh yeah.
poisonous. Like you said, the memory of cinema, because I really like that story of Erice kind of watching the Sherlock Holmes film and then expecting that every time a doorbell rang, it was a murderer of a door. And like I said, that very fun film screening was kind of like based on memories of these kind of makeshift viewings in the 1940s. The film then has this weird peculiarity, I think, and this is what really grew on me. I can well imagine what you're saying is true about it kind of growing over time, because I watched it twice in the last week. And then, even though the second viewing followed quite quickly on from the first, I was already feeling much more captivated by the film the second time, because it obviously has some things that are like explicitly weird or fantastical. And I know we'll touch on those later, but a lot of that strangeness comes through in a more subtle way, doesn't it? I think like we get these long lingering shots. We get times when the editing is really sort of elliptical and we're not really quite sure how much time has always passed between scenes. And there's a strange feeling of disorientation in that way. And to me, that kind of is a use, I think that really works well to evoke childhood, because I don't know about you, but when you think back to childhood, I don't know, the way time seemed to move as a child is different.
Yeah.
When we think back, summer seemed to last forever. Now we look back on it and all these memories kind of blur into one. And I don't know, maybe this film gets closer to capturing what that actually feels like than anything else I've seen, to be honest.
That's a good point.
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think like I'm right that it does have this weird peculiarity that's quite distinctive, I think, actually, this film?
Yeah, no, they say that time moves slower when you're learning a lot of things. It just kind of as you're taking in new knowledge, and Anna's learning everything. She's at that stage where she's a sponge and she's taking everything in, and we're learning everything with her. And because we're not given all the information, we're not given a background, we're really just picking out lots of clues. And we'll talk about this more later in like the key scenes, but there's so many clues that you have to pick up on to kind of build the story. So from that, in that respect, it's like a child's perspective.
Mm.
They're taking everything in, they're trying to get the context clues. They're trying to figure the things out with their naivete, not having that full knowledge behind them. And it's just really effective.
It's very effective, and probably worth pointing out that the film probably felt quite different to contemporary audiences as well, because I'd read that films tended to use dubbing and that child characters tended to be dubbed by women impersonating children. So here, here we in Spain, and here we have real children, of course, recorded on location. And some of the complaints about the film early on were audience members saying that the characters were inaudible. You know, there were scenes where the children whisper. So maybe the film must have seemed quite striking, and it's beautifully shot as well, isn't it? And
Yeah, there's so
it's
many
kind of
shots that could be a painting.
well, exactly. Lots of warm lighting. You know, it kind of gives it that feeling of looking back because it's almost a nostalgic warmth. Like you say, it's very painterly. I think the paintings of Vermeer in particular
Yeah.
are a big influence on the shooting of this film. And I think that this, especially around the representation of the mother, you know, scenes where she's writing a letter or playing the piano. If you then look at paintings by Vermeer, you can see the influence quite clearly, I think. And I mean, like I say, a stunning film visually. Very sad, therefore, that the cinematographer's career was actually curtailed later on by blindness. You know, something very
Oh,
painful about that. Someone obviously who was very visually adept and lost his eyesight. But yeah, it's a gorgeous film, isn't it? You know, it's really
yeah, it
stunning to look at.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Even from the outset, like I said, little detail, but those introductory illustrations, which the children, the child
Yes.
actresses themselves came up with the drawings apparently, but it kind of keys you into a lot of the key objects of the film. Okay, Raquel. So, is there anything else you want to say on a general level before we start to dig deep into some key moments?
No, I'm ready to do our deep dive. We have a lot to say.
We do. Okay, in which case we'll take a very quick break and then we'll come back to talk more about this movie. All right, welcome back, everybody, to CineHistorians. We are still here discussing the spirit of the Beehive, and we have come to the section of the podcast we call Key Moments, which I think is fairly self-explanatory. So I'm going to kick us off here, Raquel, with actually a very hyper-specific key moment, because I'm talking about the look on Anna's face during the film screening of Frankenstein near the beginning of the film. So this is when the movie comes back to the second part of the film screening of Frankenstein. I think earlier we'd seen part of the prologue of that movie, but we don't see the
Yeah.
girls at that point. Later on, we come back to them. And there are several shots of Anna's face during that part of the film, including when the child in the film, in Frankenstein, is offered a flower by the monster. And we see a shot of Anna looking deeply engrossed in the film, looking up, mouth open. It's quite a striking image, and Erice has talked about the unique nature of the actress's performance here. He said, "The scene is a document. It wasn't brought forth artificially. Evidently, it is one of the most intense images of the film because the little girl was living all of that in a totally truthful form without distinguishing between reality and fiction, and the camera was capable of capturing it. It's an unrepeatable moment." And he's talking about how it's really the only moment in the film that's captured almost documentary style with a handheld camera in a film that's very premeditated in its style otherwise. He said it's a moment that sort of goes beyond all the sort of planning you can do. And he said, "I think it's the crack through which the documentary side of filmmaking breaks into fiction. It is truly the moment of the film that most moves me, even today, and I sincerely believe that it is the best thing I've ever filmed."
Wow.
And I think he is right, but it's a powerful moment. And I think it's a pivotal moment because the girl's experience with the film in the story, it's so overwhelming that it shapes the way she then behaves through the rest of the film. And so therefore you need to believe that the girl is really overwhelmed at that moment. And it does feel to me completely like an authentic representation of that, of what it's like to discover something new as a child. So since that's one of the key themes of the film, actually this really fleeting moment becomes super, super important. And I think it's like an indelible image. Yeah. So probably the shortest key moment we might ever do, because we're talking about really, really brief stuff, but I think a good one.
Yeah, and we
How
get
did
those reactions from her later on. She's reacting to different things, and we get those beautiful close-ups of her face. But that one really stands out among all of those
yeah,
because you have a director who had that same experience as a kid watching a movie, capturing the child having that same experience watching a movie. And it's just, there's such authenticity with it. It's really quite amazing.
Yeah, and a kind of intensity to it. It feels like
Yeah.
whatever she's experiencing, it's happening like in a really powerful way to her.
Yeah.
But Raquel, that kind of teases up for. I know obviously we've talked at various points about the connection with Frankenstein, and I think you wanted to
Yeah.
dig a bit deeper into that, right?
Yes. So the scene where you were just talking about takes place when in the sort of the beginning of the movie where they're showing James Whale's Frankenstein with Boris Karloff in that makeshift theater. And I love that scene where all the children are running to the guy with the truck with the film reels, and they're like, is it a pistolero movie, which is a cowboy movie, or is it horror? Like they're so excited to see what it is. And that youthful enthusiasm is just so infectious. And I do, like you had mentioned earlier about everyone bringing in their chairs, is kind of an interesting aspect. You see that they don't get films all the time. This is something new and special, and they are just so excited for this moment because it might not come for a little while. The film Frankenstein is being shown, and what's interesting is that while they're setting up the theater, we cut to the father, Fernando, twice. The first is like a close up of him in the bee suit and the mask, and it's almost hinting that he looks sort of like a monster too. He's not quite a human, and he is looking very different with this mask and this white bee suit. And later there's a shot too of him in the study, I think listening to the radio, and then it kind of goes back to the scene with the prologue. Scene in the movie that they really show after the prologue is of Frankenstein's monster meeting little Maria. And it's the moment that this little innocent girl sees the monster, wants to play with somebody, sees him, is not scared, gives him a flower. They throw flowers in the pond. And then there's a shot that we see of little Maria's father carrying her dead body. I don't think we do see in the movie is that scene where the monster throws her in the pond when he runs out of flowers. But that's obviously the part that Ana is seeing and being so impacted with. So Frankenstein is really important in this film. Obviously, it comes at the beginning. It's the inspiration behind the movie, and it becomes important in two more scenes later on. There's that classroom scene where the two sisters are in the classroom, and it's with the cutout, like you had mentioned earlier. So this teacher has this large wooden cutout of a man for an anatomy class, and the students are tasked with telling the teacher what's missing on the body and putting like these makeshift pieces on it. It's like the heart or the lungs. And Ana is tasked with putting the eyes on the cutout. And the cutout actually has a name. He's Don Jose. And the teacher even says, don't upset Don Jose. He'll get mad at you. It's almost as if you add all these pieces, he will come to life and be able to like exert anger on the children. They put something in the wrong place. And we can imagine like this cutout is kind of like the Frankenstein's monster because, you know, Don Jose, the cutout, is a patchwork of parts, is a creation of man. He's made to look like a man, but he's like this grotesque looking version of one. So it's like Anna's kind of re-experiencing seeing the monster in the movie, seeing another monster in the classroom. And then later on in the film, she's run away from home. She's hiding in the woods at night, and she looks at her reflection in the pond in front of her, and then you see the face of Frankenstein's monster in the reflection in the pond, you know, kind of like how little Maria in the movie Frankenstein was playing at the pond when she first encounters the monster. We see Ana kind of do the same thing, and she turns around and she sees this monster who like comes out of the darkness. And it's really interesting because like the moonlight that's reflecting off the pond is like lighting his face, and the camera lingers there for a while, and you're like, wait, is that the father dressed as the monster? Like, you're not quite sure. Is it just going to be, oh, it turns out to be the father, or is it a real monster? Is someone dressed up as him? Like, what is it? It's very mysterious. And there's this beautiful shot, probably the second most powerful shot of her face, is like her lip is trembling with fear at that moment. And then it cuts to her being rescued at the end. She's sleeping by one of those like abandoned structures. It's just really, it's a beautiful way how Frankenstein is kind of used just throughout the movie to kind of be that first watching or experiencing something that's maybe evil, like the death of this little girl, but then also that final experience of like being isolated and in danger, and a real danger lurking in the woods or lurking in the background, kind of like maybe an oppressive figure coming out. I don't know. That kind of symbolism is really interesting. So I love how effectively the director uses Frankenstein through the whole movie.
Yeah, and I think that moment of the girl sort of shivering with fear, again, I think it's another moment where the boundary breaks down a little bit between like the idea of fiction and reality, because Erice said that when on set, when the like the recreation of the monster was there, she was genuinely disturbed. So it could be that that reaction is actually genuine fear. With the scene in the Frankenstein film of the monster chucking the girl into the water, so I'm not sure if because there's a long history of censorship with Frankenstein, and that scene was very often not seen, I think, by viewers.
Good point.
And it's quite a critical scene, because if you see it, it's clear that the monster is just kind of playing and didn't mean to kill the girl. So it's kind of interesting to ponder there, because if they didn't see that as context in the film, then the monster's motivations are a bit more mysterious. But I don't know what version would have circulated in Spain in around 1940 is the thing. I wanted to move things on to talk about the portrayal of the parents, because I think this is one of the more enigmatic aspects of the film. The actor playing the father was quite familiar to Spanish audiences, apparently. He had made lots of films before this one, made many films afterwards. So he would have been a familiar presence. But nonetheless, there's a really strange feeling of disconnection in the way that family unit is portrayed. So they're all introduced kind of separately. So the father, the mother, and then the girls later. I don't think there's a moment in the film, is there, where they're actually seen all together in the same shot necessarily, because in the scene where they're all together around the table, you never see them all together, I don't think. It's individual shots of the characters. Right. So you get this overall sense of like disorientation. You get these strange scenes like when the wife's in bed and we're looking at her face and it seems like she's pretending to be asleep as her husband presumably is kind of pottering around off screen. That house just feels large and empty. And that seems to me to kind of emphasize the disconnection between the parents, but also very interesting from the children's point of view. Because like, you know, when you think back to childhood, sometimes these houses felt really vast as a kid in the way that when you go back to them later on, they actually weren't, you know. So I don't know, there seems to me to be lots of unanswered questions around those parents. Like,
yeah,
we can kind of intuit a lot about what the mother is up to and who she's writing to, but we don't get all the details. We don't know exactly what's happened between her and her husband. We don't know exactly what they did during the Civil War. And again, I was very interested by what the director said, because he said he sort of remembers adults being like that when he was a child, that they'd all been through the Civil War, and that the adults were often a kind of a void, an absence. So it's almost like the parents are there, and there's a sense in which they're not actually there as well, because what he means is they'd been deprived of things. They'd been deprived of, you know, their full way of expressing themselves. And he said there's, you know, a lot of these adults were really defeated people. Like I said, we don't know the answers to everything about them. We kind of grasp things, I think, on an intuitive level. I don't know about the end of the film. It's kind of interesting to me. Like, the father's asleep at his desk. The wife appears, closes his book, takes off his glasses, turns out the light. I didn't know if that was supposed to be a sign of some kind of reconnection or something else, but I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something very intriguing, I think, and elusive about the way those parents are portrayed in this film.
Yeah, maybe that ending is sort of that shared trauma kind of brings them together, of losing Anna and then getting her back. But I think it's interesting too. I really like what you were saying about that perspective of a child not necessarily understanding a lot about their parents, and we don't really understand a lot about these parents. It's like when people ask a child, what does your parent do for a living? And they either know the words attached to it, but don't necessarily know what their parent does, or they don't actually know when they try to come up with something. And it's kind of like here, Anna doesn't really know her parents. They're mysterious. She is not quite there to really understanding them. So we're also not quite there in understanding them either. And I think it's interesting too, like there's like you said, there's all those shots of them but none of them all together, even when they're at the same table. And it's curious too, when Ana thinks, is Isabel dead? She's pretending to be dead, and she goes and calls Milagro, the maid, instead of like her mom or her dad. So it's interesting too, like you sort of see that they're distant from each other, but maybe there's like also some distance from them. But then there's also that sweet moment where the father is teaching the two daughters about the mushrooms. I think that's, you kind of see them, that sort of intimate moment between father and daughters. Yeah,
there are some important moments between the father and the children, like including one with the watch later on.
Yes.
But possibly that's relevant to what you're going to discuss next, I think, Raquel, because there's the character I mentioned earlier of the soldier who sort of comes into the picture relatively late on, I think, in the sort of towards the final third of the movie. And I think you wanted to talk about that, right?
Yes. And I think the scenes with Ana and the soldier and then what happens after is what's great about this movie, and how it feeds you these sort of visual clues, but also how everything that happens is really potent in terms of like not what is said, but what is shown. And so Ana is thinking that the monster lives in this abandoned house. When you see like these beautiful shots of this abandoned house and this well, eventually she sees that there's a footprint.
Yeah.
And the footprint in sort of the mud is really visually stunning, because you see it, then you see her little shoed feet kind of up against it, and you see the difference, and then she steps into one. And that is just so beautiful. Like, she knows that there was a man here. When she comes back and she sees him and he's bleeding, like we get that shot of him like falling out of the train and he's escaping, he's hiding in this abandoned house and he's bleeding, and she takes pity on him and she pulls out a green apple and hands it to him, and she's like 10. And this is also, if you think of like the symbolism of like an apple, maybe like a loss of innocence here, because she's getting involved in something very serious. He's running away. He's trying to escape this authoritarian government, and he's in grave danger. And she puts her family, especially her father, in danger when she gives him that watch, because she comes back several times. She gives him the pocket watch, the musical pocket watch. I think she gives him a shirt that her father wears so he can tie it around his leg. There's all these little visual clues that she's bringing stuff from the house. And the pocket watch we saw earlier in the movie, so we definitely know it belongs to the father. And then we find out that the soldier is killed, and she's at dinner with her father at that scene you were talking about, where they're all at the table but you don't necessarily see them all together. And then there's nothing said, like they're having like some sort of soup or something, and Isabel's laughing, and then the father takes out the pocket watch and plays it, and the look on Anna's face, like, oh crap, I'm in trouble because I gave that to the soldier. And then she comes back to the house and she sees the blood. And then nothing is said between the father and the daughter. He never is like, why did you give this to the soldier? You're getting me in trouble. Nothing is said, but everything is implicated in that scene visually. And I just think that is something that is so powerful about this movie, is so much is said with visuals versus dialogue.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually, that it is quite a light film on dialogue, actually. And a lot of it is like purely visual storytelling in a very interesting way. All right, so we come to the segment of the podcast we call Any Other Business, which, it's where we talk about anything else we want to, as long as it relates in some way to the film at hand. And I think we've got some good ones here for this one, Raquel.
Yes.
So we've already, I think, mentioned Iranian cinema and Where is the Friend's House in relation to this film. And I think you wanted to tease that out a bit more. Is that right? Talking about the connections with Kiarostami. Am I correct there?
Yes. So Víctor Erice is The Spirit of the Beehive, and then Abbas Kiarostami's Where is the Friend's House from 1987, which we discussed in the first season, and it's our best performing episode so far. So definitely recommend everyone checking it out. Both of these films have a lot in common because they both feature a child protagonist played by a very expressive and sympathetic child actor. And in terms of like Where's the Friend's House is just a non-professional actor.
Yep.
Through these stories, of these children, we unlock this like subtle but like strong message of living under an oppressive regime, and even making these films that criticize these regimes in those subtle ways were dangerous both for Víctor Erice and for Abbas Kiarostami. And there are lots of different ways to compare the two, like the strong sense of place, like those beautiful landscape shots, the shot of the zigzag path up the hill, and then also like in Spirit of the Beehive, these shots of like the railroad tracks or the abandoned house in the background. And it's just really, they're both very visually interesting films. Erice and Kiarostami have actually been referred to as cinema's twin orphans. So I wanted to read something quickly from Le Monde Diplomatique. It says, Erice and Kiarostami are born in the same week of the same year, but that's no reason why their paths should cross. Yet despite their different backgrounds and cultures, they become closer in their convictions and their relationships with the cinema. Both are fascinated with childhood. Both have resisted film industry pressures and asserted their independence and artistic integrity. What happened was in 2006, the CCCB, which is Centre de Cultura Contemporánea de Barcelona, had an exhibition that brought these two filmmakers together. So it was curated by the museum director and a film critic, and they were like, you know, these two filmmakers made these two films. They're very much alike, but they're also very different from very different parts of the world. What if we brought them together? And they were both on board. So this exhibit, which was called Víctor Erice, Abbas Kiarostami Correspondences, and it included lots of different works from both of them, film, photography, paintings, but part of it was these 10 filmed correspondences between the two. So each would write a postcard either in Spanish or Farsi and include a narration of them reading what they're writing. And they would send each other these short films from their respective countries. Erice's films are totally different from Kiarostami's. It's just really interesting to see the huge contrast. But the segment I wanted to point out is actually when Erice shows Classroom in Spain, in which a teacher is asking students about where is the friend's house. And the students have to be around the same age as the protagonist in that film. And this is fascinating because there are shots that are just like Anna watching Frankenstein for the first time, of the kids watching this movie for the first time. And there's a classroom discussion between the teacher and the students, which kind of mirrors what's like, you know, what's happening in the movie, which is vastly different. It's a totally different dynamic. And they're them talking about what the little boy does in the movie, the morals behind it, what they would do. And it's really fascinating. These filmed correspondences were put together and released as a documentary by the same name, Víctor Erice, Abbas Kiarostami Correspondences, and it came out in 2008. If you can find a copy of it, I watched it recently. It was really interesting, but I highly recommend even just watching that one classroom clip.
No, I think that's very interesting, and I'm wondering if maybe we could tie this back even to an earlier CineHistorians episode, which is that I think maybe both of those filmmakers, you can sort of see the influence of the French New Wave there a little bit, because I'd read that Erice, he went to French cinemas, he lived close to the border with France, and that meant he could see films that didn't actually reach Spain for release. So I think he was influenced by films like The 400 Blows, for example. And I think you can see a bit of that with, you know, the use of this kind of nostalgic recreation of childhood and the little known non-professional actors. And I think Kiarostami had said something about the French New Wave that we talked about when we talked about him as well, you know. I wanted to talk a little bit more. I've been quoting from Víctor Erice through the episode, but I think his reflections on the film are fascinating from the interviews I've seen. One of them that I thought was very interesting. Some of these are kind of about how to watch the film as a viewer, which I thought was fascinating. So he says, in no case should this be considered a narrative film, but rather a work with a fundamentally lyrical and musical structure. And I quite liked that, because I think the first time I watched the film, I wasn't quite sure how much I was supposed to be, you know, really thinking of this as a narrative film. And that kind of helps to unlock it a little bit for me. And he says, it should not be forgotten that the film centers around the world of children and a child taking her first steps towards discovering the world. Children do not have the same awareness of time as adults. And again, there's something there we've already talked about, I think, but about the fluid nature of the way time is represented in this film. It is very evocative of childhood. So it's great to hear that that's kind of purposeful. You know, it's not just kind of something that's arrived at by happenstance. I think it's very, very intentional. The idea we've already talked about the censorship and being indirect to get around the censors. What he says is that when the censors saw the film, they were intrigued. They felt that the film was saying something about history and politics, but they couldn't actually identify what it was saying. So, you know, it was a film that the censors couldn't see how to cut, as it were. And again, he's kind of relating it to the child's perspective. So the film is, he is saying that the film shows how the child sees history. The child, you know, the children don't really understand who Franco was. They don't really know the reasons for the Civil War. They sort of pick up things on a different level. Maybe there are things we shouldn't talk about. Maybe there are things that are kind of in the background. But that's kind of, for a young child, that's kind of where it stays. I always think it's interesting on the podcast, and I think because of the nature of some of the films we've talked about, it's like, how did the director actually coax such a good performance out of these actors? So whether it's Bicycle Thieves or, like you were saying, Where is the Friend's House? That's always very interesting. Erice says it's all about creating an atmosphere with these girls. You know, so they had the bedroom where they spend a lot of their time in the film. And he told the crew to follow guidelines when filming in the bedroom. So the space always had to be bathed in artificial light. He didn't want to have to depend on external light, which could fluctuate.
Yeah.
All the words that the crew should exchange in that location should be basically in a whisper, like the girls were going to be talking, you know, the girls talk in whispers for their dialogue. It should be like that kind of atmosphere, almost like you whisper, like when you're in church or something.
Yeah.
Also, the crew should move around in kind of a stealthy way, as if they're not trying to cause attention. And he said that the girls really kind of cottoned onto this, and that they felt this atmosphere. They noticed the grown-ups were very carefully moving around, were speaking very quietly, as if they were afraid of waking somebody up. And so what he says was, well, I never had to ask Anna and Isabel to get into character. And like, how do you do that anyway? How can you tell a 6-year-old to get into character and have them understand what you mean? It's more about creating that atmosphere, is what he says. Right. I was wondering, like, how do you go about this? And we've talked about the scene in the cinema and so on. And I think if those kind of relationships with the child actors had been handled differently, or if the performances were not quite as good as they are, then this wouldn't be as strong a film. You know, I think he handled it brilliantly from what I've read, you know.
And it kind of shows his attention to detail and how methodical he was in creating this movie. I remember reading that Anna was confused by having the other actors have different names from who they were. So the four principal actors all go by their own real name, and that was a way to help the young actress sort of get into this role. And it just, like, those small details, it makes a huge difference, I guess. But you would not necessarily appreciate that unless you start learning about what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, that's what we're here for, isn't it?
Yes, of course.
find those things out for our viewers and listeners. Okay, I think it's everybody's favorite section of the podcast, Raquel. It's where you do the film recommendations. One of them, at least, I think you've mentioned already. So you've got a few, I think. So why don't you run us through these?
Yeah, and there's no Luis Buñuel film in this one, so I'm saving you in this episode. And just a reminder, all the movies that we mentioned in this episode are on a dedicated Letterboxd list. So you don't have to necessarily write everything down. You just go to letterboxd.com/CineHistorians and they'll all be there. So I have 3 recommendations. The first one is another film by Erice, is El Sur, or The South, from 1983, which I had mentioned earlier. This was Erice's next film after The Spirit of the Beehive, made a decade later. It takes place in Spain in the 1950s. The narrator is an adult woman recounting 2 stages of her childhood, played by 2 different actresses. And it talks about, like, the mystery of her father's life and death. So, like with The Spirit of the Beehive, you have, like, an exploration of the different stages of innocence. There's the relationship between a young girl and her father. There's life in Francoist Spain. There's a storyline about a movie theater and a mysterious movie star. So back to that power of cinema. And the film technically isn't finished. Like I mentioned earlier, the producer pulled funding for the project because he felt like he was just going to keep going and going. So the film is technically 2/3 complete, because the story all takes place in the north, and the last third of the film would have her go to the South. So the South doesn't actually end up being in the movie, but the movie watch is very much like a complete film. So don't feel like you're going to be left hanging. It does feel with those ending scenes that there is some sort of conclusion to the story. So the next film is one of my favorite filmmakers, and it's my personal favorite of his movies, and it's Spanish director Pedro Almodóvar and his film Pain and Glory, or Dolor y Gloria, from 2019. This is semi-autobiographical. It stars Antonio Banderas, and he's playing a celebrated Spanish filmmaker like Almodóvar. And in this story, this filmmaker is suffering from severe pain and migraines, so it keeps him from work. But he's sort of in the space where he's really wanting to get back to work. The key part of this, though, in tying to the spirit of the Beehive, is that there's several flashback scenes which explore the protagonist's impoverished childhood in sort of the later part of Francoist Spain. And the protagonist's mother is played by Penelope Cruz, who, like Banderas, they were both in a lot of Almodóvar movies. And mother figures are really important in Almodóvar's work, where you see the father being more important in Erice's work. With Almodóvar, you have a lot of films about mothers, like All About My Mother or Volver. There's quite a lot. It becomes really important in this film, too. And also, this film has an astoundingly good color palette. It's worth watching for all the reds and greens and stuff in the movie too. And then the third one is While at War from 2019 by Spanish filmmaker Alejandro Amenabar, who is best known for that film The Others, one of my favorite movies. This very mysterious movie with like Nicole Kidman. So While at War takes place at the very beginning of the Spanish Civil War, and it's a biopic. It's about the novelist and university professor Don Miguel de Unamuno. He was publicly opposed to Francisco Franco, and he participates in the uprising. So the film is about like that last part of his life and how he's dealing with like the changes, how he's like protesting, and then how he repairs the relationship with his daughter. So there's a father-daughter element. The first part of that movie is kind of slow, but it's still worth watching because the second half really picks up and it's got a very powerful ending. And then there's another movie that we should recommend that is really important and inspired by the spirit of the Beehive, which I know you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I think the connections between the spirit and the Beehive and Pan's Labyrinth are definitely worth highlighting. So Pan's Labyrinth, for anyone who isn't aware, is a 2006 film directed by Guillermo del Toro. It's about a young girl who's fascinated with fairy tales. She goes with her mother to live with her stepfather, who is a ruthless captain in the Spanish army. So this is another film that's set just after the Spanish Civil War. One night, the girl meets a fairy who takes her to see this creature, a faun, who tells her that she's really a princess, but she'll have to prove this by getting through a series of difficult tasks. So lots of similarities between the two films. You know, both center around a young girl, both share the same sort of historical setting, like I said. Both play heavily on the influence of storytelling. So we've talked about the importance of Frankenstein to the spirit of the Beehive, fairy tales being really important in Pan's Labyrinth. Both of them, you have these kind of authority figures where there's a level of detachment in different ways. You get this sense of Spain as a place of unhappiness. There's a scene quite early in Pan's Labyrinth where maybe the connection comes even closer between that film and the spirit of the Beehive. It's where the girl, she comes across a statue with missing eyes, and she finds the eyes and replaces them. And of course, in the spirit of the Beehive, we've talked about the anatomy lesson with Anna replacing the eyes in the model of the man.
Yeah,
so there's
wow.
So there's things like that. There's you have freedom fighters. Both movies have a good doctor character as well. So the connections are really there, and I think they really do jump out. Stylistically, very different films, and of course, the context of production is really different because we've been talking about the spirit of the Beehive, which was made in the dying days of the dictatorship and had to be quite cryptic to navigate around that. Pan's Labyrinth doesn't have that level of restriction. We've talked about how the spirit of the Beehive is quite a terse film in terms of dialogue, much more dialogue in Pan's Labyrinth. So the similarities take you so far, and then in other ways they're very different films. But Del Toro has lavished a lot of praise on The Spirit of the Beehive. So I was reading some quotes from him where he called the film absolutely beautiful, says it's one of his favorite films about childhood. He lists it alongside The Night of the Hunter and The Innocents in terms of films about children or childhood. Yeah. He described The Spirit of the Beehive as being almost intangible and spiritual in the way it approached fantasy. It was very tenuous and delicate, he said. And he said, by contrast, he wanted to go about things a different way. He wanted to make the fantasy much more tangible, which is really what, a lot of that film is about. But, he says he doesn't idealize childhood, but he thinks it's a time where emotions are sort of unfiltered and impulses are unfiltered, including faith and belief and love, for example. And I think both films tap into that in a very strong way. So I think, normally you're the one who recommends the double bills, Raquel, but I think The Spirit of the Beehive followed by Pan's Labyrinth is not a bad one. Well, because of, like I said, the contrasts as well as the similarities. So you'd get an interesting kind of push-pull thing going on there, I think. Okay, with that said, I think that's probably a fairly appropriate place to start to draw to a close here, Raquel. Like I said at the outset, by the time we got to this point, we'd be at the halfway stage for season 2. So yeah, 4 really, really interesting films we've talked about so far. I think a really interesting variety of films still to come as we carry on looking at the Sight and Sound list from 2022. Do you want to do the honors and tee us up for episode 5 of season 2? What are we talking about next?
Yeah, we're talking about Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love from 2000.
And for anyone keeping score, this is actually another one of my picks. So I think Raquel's pick, this film today was Raquel's pick. This one coming up next is another one of mine. So by the end of the season, we'll be at 4 apiece. So it'll be nicely balanced. As ever, we'd like to encourage and remind listeners to rate and review the podcast if you're with us on the audio version. So even just taking 30 seconds or so to give us a star rating and a 1-line review would be so helpful to help us to reach more listeners, more audience members. It's even easier on YouTube, I think, Raquel, because there's a button there and all people have to do is smash it, right? That's all
and I'll put it on the screen. You can smash that subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications so you never miss an episode.
All right. So thanks, everybody, for joining us for this chat about The Spirit of the Beehive. We'll be back very, very soon. And until our next episode, please take care. Bye now.
Ciao.
You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.